Hi, everyone, and welcome to another ArchDaily interview. Knowing that no one builds on their own and that shaping the built environment calls for close collaborations between all involved actors, ArchDaily has launched an initiative that recognizes and highlights the top collaborators responsible for delivering the best architecture out there. Focusing on the professionals involved in the projects we create, the strategy seeks to help our community find the right collaborator for its next architecture venture. In order to increase their presence on our platform, ArchDaily will put in the spotlight the expertise and contributions of the engineers, consultants, designers, and contractors involved in our curated selection of published projects. In this second interview with professionals, we have with us today Arup with its principal, David Farnsworth. Hi, David.
Hi,
Mnla with its founding principal, Signe Nielsen. Hi, Signe. And Matt Cash, group leader for Heatherwick Studio, to talk more and understand about the process of their work. My name is Christele Harrouk. I'm an architect and urban designer and the managing editor at ArchDaily, and I will be your host. So our conversation will tackle in general your collaboration before focusing on a specific project, the Little Island Park, which I personally really like. So let's get started. And I want to ask each one of you, can you tell us a bit about your company, about your scope of work, how did it start, and what are the key characteristics that basically makes you who you are? And let's start with you, Matt.
Okay, so I'm a kind of a partner at Heatherwick Studio. We're a kind of multidisciplinary design practice made up of kind of architects, but also industrial designers, lighting designers, all sorts of different disciplines. And we work kind of globally on all sorts of different projects from kind of transport, including designing a car. We've done buses and boats, bridges, infrastructure, airport, urban design, all sorts of different scales. And I think what we don't see a boundary to where architecture begins and ends, because for us, it's a design discipline applied to buildings, but it could be a design discipline applied to any other facet of the lives we inhabit. And so I think that we're most interested in the kind of design challenge and whether we can make a substantial difference to a particular typology or a particular location or particular scale and try and bring some fresh thinking to that world. So that's kind of what we do. And we were founded by Thomas Heatherwick around about kind of 27 years ago. I've been at this studio for around 16 years, worked on all sorts of different projects kind of all over the world. And it was thrilling to get an opportunity to work in New York and collaborate with Signe and David on Little Island.
Okay, David from Arup.
Sure, great, thanks. So yeah, Arup's a big international multidisciplinary engineering and consulting firm. We were founded in 1946 in London and have grown, from those early roots to now be an international organization with over 17,000 staff worldwide. Our work really crosses, all types of projects in the built environment. We do buildings, we do infrastructure projects, we do urban, master planning, and all types of consulting. And here in the US, we basically have all of those services and offerings out of about 11 offices here in the Americas across the US, Canada, and Colombia. And I personally am a structural engineer and a project director and lead multidisciplinary projects.
Thank you, David. Signe, can you tell us more about Mnla?
Sure. But by comparison, we're very small, but good size for a landscape architecture firm. I've been in business for over 40 years and have led Mnla for now about 25 plus. I would say that one of the reasons that we do not generally engage in international work is that our projects are very contextual and site-based. We want to know our communities, we want to know our sites, and in order to advance what we call sort of nature-based solutions and quality of life for the communities, we feel it's important to be fairly close to them. So I'm the founding principal of Mnla, and our role on the project was, I would say, sort of general assistance and specifically landscape architecture.
Thank you, Signe, and thank you for being with us today. So let me start by asking Matt, in general, Matt, how do you think professionals have contributed? How is their impact to your projects in general?
On this project specifically, or more generally for the studio?
In general, in the studio, let's say, before jumping into the project.
Yeah, I think that because the studio gets involved in all sorts of different things, as I mentioned at the beginning. So one week we might be designing a chair, it might be designing an airport, it might be designing a car. What we don't claim to be experts in anything, but we're very, very curious, and we're very, very interested in how different projects can influence other projects of a different kind of scale or typology or location. And really that cross-fertilization across different disciplines, I think, is critical for us to bring fresh thinking to something. And so that means basically we can't do our projects without collaborating very closely with kind of experts in that particular field. It doesn't matter whether it's a car designer or a structural engineer or whatever the other disciplines might be. We're only as good as that collaboration and that process. So it's kind of in our DNA to do that, and to try and bring just a you know, I mean, David will protest this, just ask really silly questions all the time to really kind of get to the point where somebody goes, actually, I'm not sure why we do it like that. You know, usually it's like we do it because of this, we do it because, and then you'll get to that question, but no one's quite sure. It's kind of preconceived wisdom to do it. And then you kind of go, well, how about this? And then suddenly that sparks a conversation to say, actually, that might work, interesting. And then you go down a different direction, and you can only do that if you are nimble enough to move between those different things. And then you can really take learnings from one and apply it to another. And that's really, so that really speaks to the kind of collaboration and how important it is for us to do any kind of project that we do, and particularly the projects that we get involved in, which are trying to really push what's gone on before, really, you know, push technology, push change, push kind of you know, pushing against kind of preconceived wisdoms, really trying to explore the kind of the possible, if that's not too kind of cliched a term. But I think that's where the collaboration really is critical. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be possible.
And speaking of the Little Island Park, how did the collaboration start with Arup and with Mnla?
Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing about Little Island is that by being quite hard to define, you know, is it a park? Is it a theatre? Is it a piece of infrastructure? Is it a bridge? Is it, you know, what is it? And I think that because it's trying to redefine something, kind of in a way blend some different typologies together, then that's really pushing kind of structurally what it might be doing, and from a landscaping and kind of environmental side what it's doing. And so when we first started on the project, gosh, it was kind of in 2000, I think it was in 2012 that we kind of first got involved in it. So it took a long time to kind of come to fruition. We went on a journey with Barry Diller and the Hudson River Park Trust as to how to kind of repurpose an existing pier on the Hudson. So kind of Pier 54, which was an existing kind of timber pier that had fallen into poor state of repair and was actually quite dangerous, but it had been a kind of a platform for performance for that side of Manhattan for a great many years. So really it started out as a way of reimagining what a new piece of pier infrastructure might be like on the Hudson, and doing a piece of pier infrastructure that's no longer based on kind of boats. So previously we saw some amazing imagery of the existing piers around the Hudson as they were 100 years ago, when there were no container shipping and things like that. So there were kind of, you know, literally kind of dozens and dozens of existing piers, which is quite amazing, sticking out like fingers all the way around Manhattan. And Pier 54 was one of the original ones. And so it was really imagining what a new pier would be like and who's it for. So rather than being for boats, it's actually for the public. And we were inspired by the kind of incredible kind of, in a way, kind of paucity of green space in Manhattan. It's such an intense urban environment. Where are those green spaces that you can go for kind of relief, be it a pocket park or the High Line or Central Park? These kind of incredible pieces of nature that have kind of been jammed into this kind of really kind of dense urban environment, and trying to explore what that might be like when we had an opportunity to do that on the actual Hudson River, and try and put in that a new piece of kind of landscape within the kind of river itself, using the air rights of the existing pier. So that really gave us a lot of kind of engineering challenge, like how do you actually build something that could kind of sustain the kind of quite harsh environment on the Hudson River from a storm perspective, from a kind of salt aggressive attack on the concrete, you know, from all sorts of different angles. The resiliency is critical. And we're also creating kind of a public park. So maintenance and the cost of maintenance was critical. So it has to be very, very resilient. So that gave quite a bit of an engineering challenge, which really from the very first kind of presentation we gave to the client, because of Arup had worked with Hudson River Park previously, and we worked with Arups on lots and lots of projects all over the world. It was like, brilliant, Arup are involved already. Let's get going and work with them on how this kind of structure is kind of deliverable within those environments, because you know, in water engineering and all of that gives huge amounts of design challenge. So almost like from day one, from kind of when we started coming up with the ideas for a park that would be held on the river, you know, it went straight to a piece of kind of infrastructure, and looking at and how we might build it was almost the first conversation. And then once we'd started to evolve that with David and his team, we actually kind of went away thinking about, well, right, how does the park sit on this? How do we deal with the kind of the planting, and how do we deal with all the kind of all of the technical challenges of actually creating a park on top of something that will survive the kind of harsh environment of New York in the winter, that can be contextual, that can be maintainable. And we interviewed with Barry lots of different practices, and I met Signe. I can't remember the day, Signe, but it was like, yes, we found someone that kind of understands what we're talking about and can really enrich the project. And then, you know, I think, you know, for myself with David and Signe, we went then on a journey as a three, like over the next 5, 6, however many years it has been. And it's that kind of friendship and relationship that can sustain delivering a project which is immensely complex, immensely challenging, from all sorts of technical reasons, political reasons, all of those things. You have to have that kind of sense of single purpose and togetherness, and dare I say it, a kind of lack of ego, as much as we can do that in the design profession, because like ultimately it is only through that collaboration that you get to do something that is a marriage of structure and landscape and all together into one coherent place. I mean, that's my recollections. David, Signe, what your thoughts are?
I do remember during the interview, I think once they had sort of narrowed down the prospective landscape architects, Barry Dillard looked across the table at me and he said, "Can you keep these boys in line?" And I said, I looked at Matt, I'd met him for all of 10 minutes, and I said, "Yes, I can."
Yeah, Matt, your memory's great. The start was exactly like that, and there were lots of you know, client objectives. Barry, when he signed up to fund the Pier, he said he'd only do it if he could do something very different and something very special, and of course that's how we ended up with Heatherwick, you know, to achieve that. And so there were all these conflicting you know, objectives in the creation of the park, and I think Matt was exactly right in saying that we all had to, you know, come to the table and challenge conventional assumptions and you know, and find the holistic solution to really achieve something special and work within the real constraints of constructing something in the Hudson River.
Actually, just looking at the complexity of the project, it's easy to see that the collaboration between all parts was key from the beginning. And going back to you, David, you just talked about the workflow, but I want to know more about your process. How was the process of working as structural and mechanical engineers on this project with Heatherwick, with the architects?
It was great fun. I mean, you know, it was a super complex project. It hadn't, you know, something like this hasn't really been done before. In terms of, you know, a Pier project that looks like this. So there were lots of, you know, new challenges to resolve, and it was really fun. You know, Matt nailed it on the head when he said, you know, he said silly questions. I would say it might start off sounding like a silly question, and then eventually you realize that it's actually quite an insightful question, and it is challenging norms. And while some of them, you know, have easy answers, and yes, that's why we do that, and no, you can't do that, and eventually you get to a point where you say, oh, I don't know why do we always do that? Actually, that's kind of silly. It's always been done that way. Let's think about something else. And there were lots of kind of back and forth about that. I mean, there were a couple of schemes before we ended up on the on the eventual scheme that everybody sees out there today. And there was a constant back and forth of, oh, well, what about this? What about that? And how do we deal with the, the constraints of what the Hudson River Park as a client really wanted, in terms of the pier kind of structure and the makeup of the pier, and in order to minimize their kind of maintenance considerations and durability, and what the contractors needed in terms of constructability, and then what Barry and the team wanted from a design aesthetic. So it was great fun, working through all that very complex puzzle and putting all the pieces together.
I mean, one of the interesting things kind of David mentioned is that when we first kind of worked on the project, the original brief was to design a pavilion on an existing kind of pier design. And really, it felt like, why were you creating something? And the reason was to create something interesting to engage you. And I said, well, you're on a pier. A pier are incredible, engaging kind of structures in their own right. Why add something to something that already should be incredible? I think you need to improve the thing you've already got, rather than try and transpose something on top of it to kind of enrich it. And I think we try to take that principle through the whole project, really, which is like, well, the structure, for example, the reason why it's made out of concrete is because that's the only tenable material that can survive in the harsh environment of the Hudson River. It's like, you can't use any other structure, so we've got to use concrete. And the resiliency was such a key factor, because it germinated during kind of Hurricane Sandy and all of the conversations about the extremes of weather that the world is experiencing. How do you create resiliency over the next 50 years for a structure like this? And so the structure around has no kind of cladding, if that makes sense. So the whole kind of the kind of petal forms are kind of structural. And so in effect, there isn't a kind of, David, can you go and do the structural bit underneath it, and then we'll come and do the nice thing on the outside? It's not really about that. The whole thing has been kind of distilled as much down to its bare elements as possible. And that was partly financial and partly from a resiliency and a material kind of efficiency of like, look, let's not create a cladding as well, let's create one thing. So that kind of meant that ourselves and Arup had to be kind of hand in glove in terms of how the geometry works structurally, the rebar schedules that it makes. So all of that meant that the complete complex three-dimensional form was then sent between ourselves as kind of, in a way, a kind of a shared endeavor. Because you've got to get everything to be absolutely perfect together, because it's actually doing the structural job. There isn't tolerance in that thing. It's doing its job, which was kind of thrilling, because it meant you can really have a very close relationship from the structural engineering, and the structure is as efficient as it can be. I remember in the early days on the project, because those columns are obviously, they look very, very slender. And we did all sorts of worries about racking and how we'd have to put in reinforcement of those columns because of the rack. And it was thrilling when we spoke to David. He goes, no. That pot is going to lean into that pot, into that pot, into that pot, and that will transpose all of the loads down to the kind of the lowest form. So like those kind of conversations meant that it would really enrich the architecture, rather than being a fight between what we'd want to do and what the engineers are saying. It was more a case of, we can design to make the engineering work well, and the engineering can design to make the architecture look as powerful as it can. So that was a really thrilling kind of collaboration that we went on together.
So and basically this enhanced the design, right? That's what you were saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you add on the constraints of, we have a lot of elevation in the park, and you add on the constraints of the pathways and the required slopes for those. And then, we immediately, or the client immediately wanted, big trees on day one. So there's big tree pits and landscaping. And so, eventually, once we kind of settled on this idea of the pots, and then we settled on the idea of the topography, there was just so much interplay between the landscaping, the gradients of the paths, that then dictated the structural slab, elevations that needed to be. And then that in turn, came down onto the pots themselves, and we needed to make sure that the pots were, kind of steep enough in order to be effective structures, and still pretty. And so there was this like kind of three-way back and forth between Mnla and Arup and Heatherwick that, where we were all trying to resolve our portions of it, and finding kind of a combined solution to it all together. So that was really fun.
Ultimately, we worked in a three-dimensional model, because it was a project that simply could not be conceived of in plan view, or just elevations and sections. You couldn't take enough sections to describe what were the problems. And once I started getting involved in thinking about the landscape, I created an added set of challenges to the project because of the weight loads and the amount of soil needed in order to accommodate these trees, which sometimes meant that the piles couldn't take it, or sometimes it meant that Heatherwick had to reassess the profiles of the pots and the entire elevation. I mean, somebody asked me a question, how many of the original tree locations had to be modified? And I think it was almost 90%. We had to make some adjustment, either downsize a tree, move a tree, change a pot. It was a year of us working back and forth.
It's actually, it's if you move one of the things a foot, like the whole pier, like it like reverberates through the whole pier. So you actually, you move this up here, that has an implication 50 feet away because it all runs through. And because of, as David was saying and Signe was saying, because of the pathways, the ADA access, the railings, the slopes, the drainage, the geometry, the structure, all of that was a really complex thing. So almost from day one, we created a complete kind of 3D model of the project. And it was also useful for the client, just in how they understood and how they could understand the project, because it's a project that you only really understand in kind of physical models and in kind of 3D models. And so we did a lot of presentations. I mean, you know, we're going to New York quite a lot and presenting quite regularly, and literally walking the park, you know, going on the 3D model, walking around, and we were populating it with all sorts of planting that Signe was livid about because it wasn't representing the tree in the right way. And we were trying to, we were actually developing up the software with an external software engineer to make the trees more lifelike and more representative of the seasons and all that kind of stuff. So it was a kind of technological advancement in parallel with the kind of engineering advancement, and partly as a client tool. So they understood, because it's complex, very complex. So they understood what they were getting and what the experience would be, but also it was brilliant. So when you actually walk on the pier, we've walked on the pier virtually, you know, hundreds of times. And when you turn to your left, that, you know, where you go into the bathrooms when you first walk on, is it a foot that way, a foot that way, a foot back that way? When do you spot it in your eye? So you know it's there, but it's not dominating when you arrive. So intuitively you know where to go, but it's not shouting at you. Just that's one physical experience of engaging with the park. When you move through to the glade, how narrow should the entrance be? So a bit a foot wider, a foot narrower, higher, smaller? Does it give you some inclusion, but it's not feeling like you're cost? So all of that, we went through dozens of times and did dozens of walks, and that was the only way. Because when you actually get on site, even with this, you know, any site, you know, it's like all those interfaces, you can't draw absolutely everything. And so with the 3D model, we've got to look at all of those interfaces of railings, steps, slope, planters, you know, all of those interfaces, dozens of those. So I think, you know, we made a huge amount of models, physical models in the studio. We did mock-ups of the pots in the studio. We did slope. I've got some hilarious photos of the client sitting on different slope angles and feeling like what it would feel like to be on a slope like that against that. And I think that was like, you know, the studio's got its own workshop and kind of prototyping facilities in our London kind of base. And so all of that kind of the making of it was kind of critical. This was a real piece of kind of proper making. And when we got involved with Fort Miller and the main contractors, that's when we really could make big pieces of this stuff and really test out how it was all going to work, because it was pretty much prefabricated. I mean, you know, those pots are precast and floated down the Hudson and craned up in space. So you've got to make sure that thing comes together. And, you know, the sleepless nights that I know I had, I'm sure David had at least, in terms of like how vertical those piles were when they get driven, because the pot has to fit on top. And if those piles are over there and those piles are over there, those pots aren't going to meet, or they're going to meet too close. So I think there's all sorts of complexity in it. And I think that the way also that I kind of think about the project is a bit like a Swiss Army knife, because there are so many, you know, green space is so precious in New York, and that space over the Hudson River is so precious. It had to do as many jobs as possible. It has to feel bigger than it is, because it's not a big park. not a big part, but it's got to serve as many different functions as people as possible. And that is partly the topography that allows you to do that by sheltering some areas from another. You have a performance here while reading a book over there, while exploring over there. And that's deliberate. It's not just, oh, this would be lovely to see. It's actually how you can create a very flexible space that you want to go back and experience again and again because it's so precious in that location.
Signe, actually, I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about the landscape part, how do you think the landscape and vegetation complemented this whole structure? And what would you say is your biggest contribution to this park, to this public space?
Well, I guess I first ought to add on to what David and Matt were saying about sleepless nights. So my sleepless nights related to the slopes and a concern that in a heavy rain, all this soil would sort of wash down the hill and end up in the plaza. So I think that one of the contributions that we made was to really think about these slopes in a way that would create stability, would create enough soil volume for the trees, and also assist with kind of the choreography of moving up the paths, because there was an aspiration for these for really significant topography, which I should also add actually adds 1/4 of an acre in physical access and surface area to the park, which is really significant. And so I think that in some ways the largest trees accentuate the topography, which was intentional. They also frame views, and very much the whole sort of planting concept is that sometimes you're looking out at the Hudson River, sometimes you're looking back into the park, at other times you're looking out at the cityscape. So even within a pretty short travel distance, you've been able to take in what I call the borrowed scenery of the Hudson River, New Jersey, and the New York City skyline, in addition to the park itself.
Okay, and David, in terms of how did you actually manage to give Signe what you wanted?
Yeah, I mean, when Matt mentioned that you change something over here and it impacts something over here, he couldn't be more true. And we luckily realized that pretty early on, and in combination with Heatherwick started working parametrically. So much of the 3D geometry that we created was all parametrically generated, such that all of this tweaking, which went on forever, didn't mean that our team was stuck up late at night remodeling all the structure in order to adjust the slab by 6 inches. And so we really had a good automated workflow, which is probably the reason why we're all still friends, because we would have been a lot less flexible if we were doing all of that manually, and we would have been a lot and it wouldn't have been able to achieve the result. We would have had to make tons of compromises just because of fee pressures and time pressures associated with delivering the job. And by automating so much of the kind of geometric generation, it just freed us to really find these holistic solutions to all of our problems. And it wasn't like, well, I've done the structure, you guys deal with it, sort out the drainage on your own. Well, we were doing drainage too, so that would still be my problem, but sort out your own tree pit, or who cares if that pot's ugly. We were all a lot more flexible to work together and make changes, because we've really cut out a lot of the kind of grunt work and the generation of the geometry.
And
One
Matt,
thing
is
I just want to
Yeah.
say about the collaboration is the problem solving, and that maybe the problem was posed to us by the client, maybe it was by Hudson River Park Trust, maybe it was by our own machinations, but the other aspect I think that was so crucial to this successful collaboration was we all looked at it as how to solve a problem, or any number of problems. And I just have to, I mean, both Heatherwick and Arup were the first people to step up and say, let's see how we can solve this. And it was remarkable. I mean, the client really benefited from some intensely brilliant minds here.
Well, I think it's interesting about the project itself. I think if you have a project with a level of kind of ambition and an interest behind it, then in our experience as a studio, people give their all to realize it. And I think that, you know, both the client gave their all kind of emotionally into the project and wanting it to be special. And, you know, David, Signe, and all the other people that worked on it was kind of going, we want this to succeed. So to David's point earlier, it's like, it didn't come down to a kind of, I've done my bit, you go and do your bit. The project wouldn't allow that anyway, because it's too interconnected to allow that process to happen. But also, if you kind of believe in something passionately, you'll work your best for it, and then you'll do the late nights and do the commitment and do the weekend phone calls and do all that stuff to kind of make it a real thing if you believe passionate in it. So I think that, you know, in the studio's experience, if you do something that is galvanizing, then you get everyone behind, because they're all pushing themselves into what they think is possible and their edges of their learnings. And if you get a group of people all pushing to the edges of their learnings, that's thrilling and exciting, and then you galvanize a whole team together to deliver something. And so it's actually in a funny way easier sometimes to do progressive things, because it excites the human spirit, if that's not too kind of want to a better kind of expression, because that then, you know, you will get the extra 10%, 20%, probably 50%, David, Signe, that this project kind of demanded to make it realizable.
Was anything on the table? I have to ask that, because as like leaders of the project, did you, like, how much would you compromise, Matt?
Well, I think that we had most of our big conversations were with the client. You know, David and Signe and ourselves, we kind of had a really close working relationship, and we were all trying to do something kind of incredible for New York. You know, wanted to do something significant on this site. And then it was really about the clients, which are the Hudson River Park Trust and kind of and Barry Diller and his foundation. It was those two heads, and Hudson River Park Trust quite reasonably who are kind of going to be bequeathed this is, you know, thinking about maintenance and looking after it and security and all of those real practical things which are critical really for a piece of urban infrastructure in New York. They ask the questions that need to be asked and challenge us as designers to go, okay, that's great, but what about this? What about that? How are we going to maintain that? How often do I need to replace that? You know, all of those questions, which are awkward questions, but they're good questions, because it means that in 5 years or 10 years, I can go back to the pier and hopefully it pretty much looks like it does today. The plants are more mature, but like, because it's resilient, right? And then Barry, who kind of gave the kind of the vision behind it and the drive and the passion behind creating something extraordinary, you know, he was contributing a lot of the foundation's money to doing something special in New York. So each of, you know, building something on the water is an expensive undertaking. There's no question about it. It's very, very expensive. Building in New York is a very expensive undertaking, regardless of the location. So those two things meant that Barry really had to believe in the project. And us as designers, we were trying to create something thrilling for him, and also to show him what each of the options would be like. So if you spend X amount, it would be like this. If you spend Y amount, it would be like this. We would recommend this, but what do you think? And that's why the whole imagery, walking the park, understanding, because every, you know, whether the curve is that high or that high or that high makes a difference. Makes a difference in cost, resiliency, aesthetics, all of those things. So we had to go into every single detail a lot with Barry, and we had dozens of presentations, because it's much better and cheaper to show things on paper and in 3D than it is to build it and regret it. And so that was really important to take Barry on that journey. And he was incredibly generous with his time and his commitment to the project. I mean, you know, very, very busy individual, and gave his kind of spirit and energy to try and create something amazing for New York. And so I think those were the real wrestles, because it was like Hudson River Park asking really good, strong questions that needed answering, and Barry trying to decide where would the financial contribution go? Where would it be best placed? And us kind of wrestling and trying to help him figure that out was where a lot of it. But as a collaborative group, as a consultant group, you know, I think it was, to Signe's earlier point, it was really about embracing the problems, because on a project like this, you get hundreds of problems. It's just you're inevitable. But they, kind of, it's a shared thing. Like, how are we going to solve this? It's not structure, off you go, David, I'll speak to you in a week, because inevitably that will have an implication on the overall form, and then the implication of how the paths work and how you approach the pier. And then that might then have a knock-on implication for the planting and how the landscaping would work. So there wasn't a singular problem that could be pocketed. They were all shared because they had impacts everywhere.
I think there was a lot of compromise as well, and even just the fundamental nature of the project, and there was always this kind of tension between whether it was a park or whether it was a performance venue, and even within the client group there was kind of it would come in waves, and it would, I think, the park was always taking the primal role, or the prime role, but the but the ambitions for the level of kind of production support that would go on for the performance venues, and the amphitheater and the glade and what they call the playground now, we used to call the main plaza. I think there was lots of discussions and around that between both the landscaping and the architecture that was quite interesting.
I mean, David, you remind me of one particular meeting we had in London when originally the original brief was that it was a park with a potential to have huge gatherings of 2,000 or 3,000 people on the main space for Hudson River Park for events. That was the original brief. And we started to introduce, we thought, well, that's a big event, and wouldn't you want to have more informal, smaller scale performance? And which is where the glade kind of idea started to germinate. But also we presented at one presentation quite early on in the project the idea of an amphitheater looking out over the Hudson River to really be protected by the geometry around it to then bring you out to the water. And Stephen Daldry, who was advising the client at the time, said, "You don't know what you suggested there. The implications of that are incredible." And we were like, yes, this would be fantastic for New York, going to be amazing. But actually, the green rooms, the infrastructure, all of that within it created a huge kind of level of complexity in addition to, but I think one of the richest parts of the park experientially and its purpose. So it was an idea that the studio kind of suggested to the client as something that would enrich the park. And it was one of those ones which, when they said yes, we're like, oh, that's great. And then we realized what that meant in terms of the overall facility and the complexity that would be brought to the project, because it's really got a building underneath the park that you don't kind of see. People think it's just an elevated series of structures, but it's not. It's a building, and there are toilets and green rooms and facility in there, which then serve the park above. And so when I talk about Swiss Army knife, that's an element of it that you don't see. You flip it out and it flips back in again. And then to David's point about the park as against the performance, in all our presentations, we had a single slide that said park first, to ground everybody like it's a park. And it also does things, because that's what the original pier that was there did. And the Hudson River Park master plan, in a way, gave a performance to this area of the park in terms of Hudson River Park, all the way up the southwest side. So this was for performance, even at a master plan scale. So it had to have that component. And when you look at like the main space, each of those curves, which look, oh, they're nice curves and all that, they are defined on the fire truck turning around and be able to have a stage exactly there to show exactly there. And the slopes that are around there, I don't know how many studies we did with Arup, Arup on the slopes, but like in terms of the kind of the view cone that you get, the sight lines, but the slope was designed to be able to view the stage in a certain location. So that was also a level of complexity. So although it looks like a lovely park to amble around, which is kind of the point, it can transform into these different worlds and work hopefully really, really well. And that was where the complexity was.
Yeah, it introduced a ton of problems and puzzles to solve. And and we talk about all of this building underneath the park, and that wasn't a foregone conclusion. That was, I think, one of the greatest kind of clever solutions to it. All of a sudden the amphitheater required all of the support space, and what are we going to do? Take up the space on top of the park with a building that sticks out and is an eyesore? And by figuring out a way to adjust the geometry to nestle that that back of house space and the bathrooms underneath the park, I think was a masterstroke.
How do you think this park actually contributes to the city? David, you live in New York, right?
I do.
Is that right?
Yeah, and so does Signe. We both live on the
Okay.
west side and downtown, so definitely within walking distance of the park.
Mm.
I mean, as Matt said, we're starved of green space, especially downtown. The lucky Upper East Siders and West Siders, they have Central Park and can go for runs. And Hudson River Park has been an amazing thing for the west side of Lower Manhattan. Even though it's predominantly a linear park with little pockets of parks on each of the piers running up, and this just adds to that infrastructure and adds a bit of a destination connection to the end of the High Line. And my favorite thing about the park is we can drive by it and my kids look out the car window and say, hey, there's Daddy's Pier. So that's pretty sweet.
I think the one thing I would add, I totally agree with everything David said, is that I think that the more I spend time out there, and I do go once a week to meet with the horticultural team and the gardeners to see how things are doing. And I've started to think about how people are observing and interacting with the landscape. And I think it offers a challenge in what does park mean? I mean, aside from what Matt talked about with the capacity of for these various cultural venues within the park, I think it also challenges, is this a garden in a park or a park in a garden? Because it is there, the proportion of the open space that's not occupied by a hardscape or the theater is a rather high percentage of inaccessible landscape. In other words, it's not lawn. And so it's started to get me to think about whether this is in fact a garden in a park or a park in a garden. And anyway, I think it offers a new kind of paradigm of park typology that doesn't exist elsewhere in New York City. I mean, perhaps on the High Line in terms of the relative proportion of hardscape to landscape. But I think when people think park, they think, okay, there's going to be playgrounds and basketball courts, and there are going to be these things I can do there. And one of the things about Little Island is that ostensibly there's nothing to do there. I mean, if you're going for a performance, that's one thing, but a lot of it is just, strolling, walking, enjoying, looking, having a beverage with a friend, picnicking on the lawn. Oh, by the way, listening to, a rehearsal or playing a musical instrument yourself. It's kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing.
So it's the experience of the place.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, before ending this beautiful and very interesting conversation, I just wanted to ask you, what would be the general key features, according to you, of course, and according to your experience, for a successful collaboration? Matt. You've all had so many collaborations. I'm pretty sure you can come up with some general features that you think are important. I see it and I hear a lot of professionals and architects talk about friendship, and Matt mentioned this, so has David and Signe. So
I mean, for me, I think it's really important, and we try and do this as a studio, is to be confident that you don't know everything, and that being okay, and that there are people that know more than you in certain areas, and that being excellent, and you be open to learn from them, and they be open to learn from you, and through that exchange of expertise and skill, you enrich the whole. So I think that's really about being open to not knowing things and being confident enough to say, don't know about that, can you teach me about that? And not worry about trying to pretend you know more than you do. And I think if you enter into that collaboration with an open kind of humility and honesty, then you get that back. And I think that for me is critical. And then the friendship and the empathy and all of that comes from that open-minded thing. And I think that's critical in my mind, at least.
Yeah, I like the idea of, you have to bring the confidence, to the table and the expertise to the table, but you need to leave the ego at the door. And I think there has to be something said for, having the client who's, willing to, let the teams get on and and deliver it together. You know, some clients tend to want to divide and conquer and, you know, pit consultants against each other and utilize, you know, one consultant to make the hard decisions against the other consultant rather than just being honest and saying, look, I don't have that money, or no, I don't want to do that. You know, they try to say, well, you know, can you tell them that that's not feasible? And I think it helps when the client is you know, as brutally honest and open as in this case the Diller von Furstenberg Family Foundation was.
I would just add to that that before the friendship comes trust, and once we all trusted each other, which meant all the things that David and Matt have just said, which is knowing that they would leave their ego at the door. Not to say that there wasn't always somebody in charge, but that really made the best idea win here in terms of how we solved problems. And yes, we did develop a very close friendship. And yes, I would say that we were a bit of well, of course, this is a New York reference, a blue wall. In other words, like the police, that you could not pit one of us against the other. That we responded to all challenges, questions as a united front. And we would discuss them in advance, and maybe we needed to adjust something, but we would not ever point a finger at another on this project.
Because I think that's a really, because you can't do this project like that. And I think that there's a kind of slightly adversarial, conflict-based, traditional way of doing construction, right? That we've all been involved in various points of our careers. And on a project, you know, which notwithstanding that, I don't think is a model that really works in today's kind of methods. But particularly on this project, you know, there's no point me, you know, saying, oh, that's Arup's fault, they should have done X, Y, or Z or whatever, because it's all one scheme, it's one thing. It doesn't help anybody. And if I've got to solve a problem, it's going to be with David and Signe and vice versa. And so you can't do that. And I think and if you believe in the project and you believe in the process, then there's no need to do that, because you help each other. And the problem is an abstract thing that's separate from what you're doing. It's a thing over there. It's not a thing that sits with any one individual. It's actually over there, and you all go and solve it together.
And that collaboration was contagious and visible for all, and it spread not only amongst our three firms, but amongst the other firms that contributed to the designs of the project, and more importantly to the contracting team. And I think that was one of the things that was very unique about this project, was the level of collaboration, you know, and trust that was established between the design teams and the contractor teams. And as Matt said, you know, the vision is kind of contagious and motivational. And you know, Fort Miller picked this project up, and Weeks Marine, and you know, and they hadn't done stuff like this before. There was a huge leap of faith that we weren't going to, you know, stick it to them on our specifications, and that we were going to go on this journey together and solve the problems together. And really, I think that collaborative nature across the, you know, the full spectrum, from design team to client team to contractor team to, you know, to the operational team, was super critical in the success.
Agreed.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Signe. Thank you, David. Thank you, Matt, for sharing all this information with us. You would like to add anything else?
Come visit.
I would love to. Thank you again for taking part of this ArchDaily interview, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.